Here is the word priority. Take a moment with it. It entered the English language in the 14th century, and for 500 years, until roughly the early 20th century, it existed only as a singular noun. The very first or prior thing. The one thing that, above all others, took precedence. There was no such word as priorities, because the concept resisted plurality. If everything mattered most, then nothing did. The language knew this, even if it couldn't say it directly. Somewhere in the 20th century, as organizations grew more complex, as the pace of professional life accelerated, as the number of things demanding attention multiplied beyond anything the 14th century could have imagined, we collectively decided to pluralize the word. We started talking about our top priorities, and then our 5 priorities, and then someone in a meeting said, "We have 12 priorities this quarter," without anyone in the room stopping to. Notice that 12 priorities is a linguistic impossibility, a grammatical contradiction that reveals the exact confusion the word was invented to prevent. This is where Greg McKeown begins Essentialism. Not with a productivity tip, not with a morning routine, not with a system for managing your inbox. He begins with a word, specifically with what happened to a word over the course of 5 centuries, because he wants to show you that the problem he's diagnosing is not a personal failure. It is a cultural one. We have been trained, gradually and comprehensively, to believe that doing more is always better. That yes is more generous than no. That the busy person is the important person. That the fully packed schedule is the sign of a life well lived. And this training has been so thorough, and its effects so pervasive, that most of us have completely lost the ability to do the one thing that the original word priority was designed to help us do. Identify the single most important thing and protect the time, energy, and attention required to actually do it well. Essentialism. The Disciplined Pursuit of Less was published in 2014. It has sold more than 2 million copies and been translated into 40 languages. It has been named Steve Harvey's favorite book. It has been cited by Silicon Valley executives, Olympic athletes, and educators. It has spawned a 10th anniversary edition with a 21-day challenge. And its central message, which McKeown himself summarizes in 3 words borrowed from German industrial designer Dieter Rams, is simply this: weniger aber besser. Less but better. This is the book's entire argument. Everything else is elaboration, illustration, and practical guidance for how to actually live it. Let's walk through all of it, the full architecture, every concept, every section, and then turn to the honest, critical examination that the book both invites and deserves. Part 1. Essence, the core mindset of the Essentialist. The book is organized in 4 parts. The first part is called Essence, and it establishes the philosophical and psychological foundation before any practical tools are introduced. McKeown wants you to genuinely understand what you're dealing with before he shows you how to deal with it. He opens with a composite character he calls Sam Elliott, a capable executive at a Silicon Valley company whose performance was, before his acquisition by a larger firm, excellent by any measure. Smart, reliable, committed, producing good work. And then the acquisition happened, and Sam found himself in an environment that rewarded a completely different kind of behavior: constant availability, perpetual agreeableness, the signaling of busyness as a proxy for value. He started saying yes to everything. He joined every committee, attended every meeting, answered every email, took every call. And within months, his output, his actual, meaningful contribution to things that mattered, had plummeted. He was more visible than ever and less effective than he had ever been. He was everywhere. He was doing nothing. This story is the book's originating problem. Not that Sam was lazy or unmotivated. Not that he lacked discipline or intelligence. But that he had been swept into what McKeown calls the undisciplined pursuit of more, the cultural default setting that most of us are running on, most of the time, without ever consciously choosing it. McKeown identifies 3 interacting forces that produce this default. The first is too many choices. The modern world presents us with an effective infinity of things we could be doing at any given moment: projects, commitments, opportunities, obligations, and the sheer quantity of options produces a kind of cognitive overwhelm that makes deliberate selection almost impossible. We can't possibly evaluate all the options carefully, so we evaluate them quickly, and quick evaluation almost always defaults to yes, because yes feels like opportunity and no feels like loss. The second force is what he calls too much social pressure. The people around us, colleagues, managers, family, friends, the ambient social environment, are constantly, often subtly, communicating what they want from us. And human beings are exquisitely sensitive to social pressure, shaped by millions of years of evolution to be deeply attuned to what their group expects. The person who says no to requests risks being seen as unhelpful, selfish, not a team player. The person who is always available, always willing, always accommodating is rewarded with approval. And approval, however cheap, is genuinely difficult to give up. The third force is what McEwen calls the idea that we can have it all. This is perhaps the most pervasive and most damaging of the three, the cultural mythology that it is possible, through sufficient effort and cleverness, to do everything and do it well. To have the flourishing career and the fully present parenting and the deep friendships and the maintained health and the pursued passions and the regular vacations and the side projects. That you don't have to choose. That trade-offs are only for people who haven't figured out the system yet. McKeown's counterclaim, the one that is both obvious and consistently resisted, is that trade-offs are real, non-negotiable, and inescapable. You cannot say yes to one thing without saying no to something else. Every commitment takes time, energy, and attention that is then not available for other things. This is not a problem to be solved. It is the structure of a finite life. And the only question is whether you are making the trade-offs deliberately, with full awareness of what you're choosing and what you're giving up, or whether the trade-offs are being made for you. By default, by the requests and expectations and pressures of the environment around you. His reformulation of the three non-essentialist assumptions is worth sitting with carefully because it is where the mindset shift actually lives. The non-essentialist says, I have to. The essentialist says, I choose to. The non-essentialist says, it's all important. The essentialist says, only a few things really matter. The non-essentialist says, I can do both. The essentialist says, I can do anything, but I cannot do everything. Each of these is a small linguistic shift that conceals an enormous philosophical one. The movement from I have to I choose to is the movement from victimhood to agency. The movement from it's all important to only a few things really matter is the movement from paralysis to clarity. The movement from I can do both to I can do anything but not everything is the movement from fantasy to reality. Part 2. The paradox of success and why achievement can be your worst enemy, one of the most counterintuitive observations in the book, and one that rings true for almost everyone who has experienced meaningful professional success, is what McEwen calls the paradox of success. The argument runs as follows. You focus. You work hard and deliberately on the things that matter most. Because of that focus, you produce results that are genuinely excellent. Those results attract attention, recognition, and opportunity. And the opportunities now flowing toward you because they are real and they are good, begin to dilute the very focus that produced the success in the first place. McEwen describes this as a four-phase loop. Phase 1. You have clarity of purpose, which enables you to succeed. Phase 2. That success brings you a reputation for capability, which attracts new options and opportunities. Phase 3. You now have more options than before, which creates diffusion, your time and energy spread across more things. Phase 4. You become distracted from what is most important, and your effectiveness diminishes. Paradoxically, success has undermined the conditions that made success possible. He traces this loop across organizations as well as individuals. Jim Collins, in his study of how great companies decline, identified the undisciplined pursuit of more as one of the primary mechanisms of organizational decay. Companies that achieve genuine excellence attract resources and opportunities that invite them to expand, diversify, replicate their success in adjacent domains, and in doing so, dilute the essential focus that made them excellent in the first place. Southwest Airlines said no to serving meals and assigned seating and dozens of other things that every other airline offered, and that focused no produced the consistent, reliable profitable service that made them legendary. The moment they started saying yes to everything other airlines did, they became everything other airlines were: expensive, inconsistent, and ordinary. The antidote to the paradox of success is not to stop succeeding. It is to apply more deliberate, more selective criteria to what you take on, as success opens more doors. Which means that the more successful you become, the harder, not easier, it is to maintain the essentialist discipline. Because the temptation grows. The opportunities are real. The pressure to capitalize on the momentum is real. And the courage required to say no to genuinely good things in order to protect time for the genuinely great things becomes, at the moment of your greatest success, the most important discipline you have. Part 3. Explore. Discerning the vital few from the trivial many. The second part of the book is called Explore. And it addresses one of the most important and most overlooked prerequisites for essentialism. You cannot identify what is truly essential unless you create the space, real, protected, deliberately allocated space, to think clearly. McEwen opens this section with an observation that is obvious once stated and almost universally ignored in practice. The pressures of modern professional life are systematically designed to keep you in reactive mode. There are always more emails to answer, more meetings to attend, more immediate problems demanding your attention than you have time for. And the person who is perpetually reactive, who goes from crisis to task to notification to request in an endless chain, never has the mental spaciousness required to ask the question that essentialism depends on. Of all the things I could be doing, which is the most important? He cites the example of Newton, who developed the theories that became Principia Mathematica during a period in which Cambridge University was closed due to the bubonic plague, and he was forced to retreat to his family's estate. 18 months of enforced solitude and reflection produced some of the most consequential scientific thinking in human history. And McKeon's point is not that we all need a plague to create space for thinking, but that the Newton example represents an extreme version of something that all genuine intellectual and creative achievement requires: uninterrupted time to think, which almost nobody is protecting in their actual daily schedule. He introduces the concept of playing journalist, the practice of regularly reviewing your life the way a journalist would review a story, stepping back from the details to see the larger pattern, asking which threads are actually leading somewhere significant and which are going nowhere. He suggests scheduling time for this, literal, blocked, recurring calendar time that is not meetings, not email, not any form of reactive work, but simply protected space to think about the direction of your life and work. Connected to thinking space is what McEwen calls being selective, specifically the application of a much higher standard to what you say yes to than most people apply. He introduces what he calls the 90% rule. When evaluating any opportunity, commitment, or decision, ask whether it scores above 90% on your most important criteria. If the answer is not a clear, enthusiastic yes, the answer is no. Not maybe. Not we'll see. Not let me fit it in. No. The logic behind the 90% rule is precise and counterintuitive. When you evaluate an option at 70 or 60 or even 80%, you are implicitly concluding that it's good enough to include, that the minor gap between this option and your ideal is not worth forfeiting. But what you are actually doing is filling your available time and energy with things that are good enough, which means that when something genuinely excellent appears, the real 95% opportunity, you don't have room for it. The accumulation of good enough commitments is the primary mechanism by which great becomes impossible. The discipline of keeping your standard high enough that most things fail, it is what preserves the capacity for excellence. Part 4. The power of play, sleep, and selective attention. This section of the book is where McEwen argues for things that the productivity culture he is writing against has systematically devalued, and makes the case for them not on moral or aesthetic grounds, but on practical ones. He is not asking you to play or sleep because your soul deserves nurturing. He is arguing that play and sleep are prerequisites for the quality of thinking and judgment that essentialism requires. On play, he draws on the research of neuroscientist Stuart Brown, who studied the childhoods of murderers in Texas prisons in the late 1960s and found, strikingly, That the one characteristic most shared by violent criminals was not abuse or poverty or any of the factors typically foreground in criminology. It was the absence of play in childhood. Play, unstructured, purposeless, intrinsically motivated activity, appears to be one of the primary mechanisms through which the brain develops the social intelligence, emotional flexibility, and creative capacity that allow people to navigate adult life effectively. McEwen extends this beyond childhood. He argues that play, in the broad sense of any activity pursued for its own sake rather than as a means to an outcome, is not the opposite of work. It is one of the primary sources of the creativity, perspective, and genuine insight that make excellent work possible. The executive, who has eliminated every form of play from their life in the name of productivity, has eliminated the very mental states from which the most valuable insights tend to emerge. On sleep, McEwen is both emphatic and specific. He cites research showing that 1 hour less sleep per night for a week produces cognitive impairment equivalent to a blood alcohol level of 0.1%, legally drunk in most jurisdictions. And he makes a pointed observation about the culture of sleep deprivation that pervades competitive professional environments, the badge of honor around being tired, the implicit status of the person who stayed up late and arrived early, the macho posturing around not needing rest. This culture, he argues, confuses the performance of dedication with actual effectiveness. The person who protects their sleep, who understands that cognitive performance is their most important professional asset and that asset deteriorates measurably with insufficient rest, is not being indulgent. They are being disciplined about the thing that enables everything else. He also addresses what he calls selective listening, the essentialist capacity to genuinely filter the enormous volume of information competing for attention, extracting only what is actually signal and letting everything else pass without engagement. Most people, he observes, give equal weight to everything, treating every notification, every piece of news, every casual conversation as equally deserving of their mental resources. The essentialist applies the same selective criteria to information that they apply to commitments. Most of it is noise, a few things are signal, and the capacity to tell the difference is not an innate quality, but a practice skill. Part 5. Eliminate. Cutting out the trivial many. The third part of the book is called Eliminate, and it is where McEwen gets most practically specific about the mechanisms of saying no, uncommitting, and clearing the space that essentialism requires. It is also, for most readers, the hardest part of the book, not because the concepts are difficult to understand, but because the execution runs directly against social programming that runs very deep. He begins by naming the single most important word in the essentialist vocabulary, no. And he is immediate about the discomfort it creates. Saying no, to requests, to opportunities, to things that are good but not essential, feels like letting people down. It feels like closing doors. It feels, in cultures that equate yes with generosity and no with selfishness, almost like a social transgression. And McEwen does not dismiss this discomfort. He acknowledges it fully. But he makes a point that reframes it. The clearest no is almost always kinder than the vague yes. The vague yes, the yes you say when you mean no, the yes followed by weeks of procrastination and underdelivery and eventual failure to execute, is not generous. It does not serve the person who asked. It creates false expectations, wastes their time, damages the relationship far more than a clean no would have, and consumes your own resources in the process of delivering something mediocre where a clear refusal would have allowed them to seek better help elsewhere. The courage to say no clearly and immediately is not only good for you. It is a form of genuine respect for the person asking. He offers specific tools for the mechanics of saying no gracefully because the abstract willingness to say no and the concrete capability of doing it in real interactions are different things. One formulation, he suggests, separate the decision from the relationship. The discomfort of saying no is often not really about the request itself. It is about the fear that saying no to the request means saying no to the person. That declining the commitment signals a withdrawal of care or regard. Separating these, making it clear that your refusal is about your capacity and priorities, not about the value of the relationship, removes much of the emotional weight from the word. Another technique, use the phrase, "What should I deprioritize?" when a superior is pressing you to take on something that would genuinely overload your existing commitments. This reframes the conversation from "can you do this?" to "which of my current responsibilities matters least to you?" Which is the actual question, whether or not it has been acknowledged. Most managers, when forced to consider the trade-off explicitly, will either find the new task less urgent than they presented it or will provide genuine help in clearing something from your plate. The question makes the trade-off visible, which is exactly where McEwen wants it to be. He also addresses what he calls sunk cost bias, the well-documented psychological tendency to continue investing in things that are not working simply because we have already invested in them. The film you're watching is terrible, but you've already paid for the ticket and sat through an hour, so you stay. The business initiative is clearly not going anywhere, but you've already spent 2 quarters and significant budget on it, so you continue. The relationship has been draining and joyless for 2 years, but you've already given so much that leaving feels like declaring the whole thing a waste. McEwen borrows a formulation he attributes to Daniel Shapiro of LinkedIn, the reverse pilot. Instead of asking, "Is this commitment worth continuing?" which invites all the distortions of sunk cost thinking, ask, "If we were not already doing this, would we choose to start?" Stripped of the investment already made, which is gone regardless of what you do next, does this commitment justify the resources it requires? This reframe cuts through the fog of past investment and forces you to evaluate the present and future value of the thing, which is the only value that is actually relevant to your current decision. Part 6. Essential intent. The one decision that makes 1,000 decisions. One of the most important and most underappreciated concepts in the book is what McEwen calls essential intent, and it is worth spending real time on because it is the conceptual linchpin that holds the entire system together. An essential intent is not a mission statement, and McEwen is clear about why. Most mission statements are so broad and so vague that they provide no actual guidance about what to do in any specific situation. We aim to be the world's most trusted partner in delivering innovative solutions. This tells you nothing about whether to take the meeting, accept the project, or decline the opportunity. It is designed to be unobjectionable rather than useful. An essential intent is also not a goal, because most goals are either too narrow, increase revenue by 15% this quarter, which guides specific decisions but provides no framework for the larger direction of a life, or too vague in the opposite direction. An essential intent is something in between, specific enough to guide genuine decision-making in real situations, but broad enough to apply across the full range of your time and energy. McEwen uses the example of a nurse named Kath who worked in oncology and whose essential intent was to make every moment count for patients and families. This is specific enough to tell her what matters in each interaction: the quality of presence, the attentiveness, the genuine care she brings to difficult conversations. And it is broad enough to apply to everything she does, across the full range of her work. When she asks herself whether a particular action aligns with her essential intent, the answer is clear without requiring additional deliberation. The practical value of a genuine essential intent is the elimination of a whole category of decision-making. Once you know what your one thing is, what the single most important direction of your life and work is, thousands of smaller decisions make themselves. The question, should I take this meeting / accept this project / pursue this opportunity, stops being a fresh deliberation every time and becomes a simple application of a criterion that has already been established. The clarity that McEwen is prescribing is not clarity about the future, which is unknowable. It is clarity about your own values and priorities, which is entirely within your power to establish. Part 7. Execute. Removing obstacles and making the essential effortless. The fourth and final part of the book is called Execute, and it addresses the gap between having identified what is essential and actually doing it consistently, especially in a world that is constantly generating pressures, interruptions, and invitations to do non-essential things instead. McEwen opens a section with an observation that is both simple and counterintuitive. Most productivity systems treat the problem of execution as a problem of force, of applying more willpower, more discipline, more effort to push through obstacles and maintain focus. The essentialist approach is almost exactly the opposite. If something that is essential keeps not getting done, the first question is not, how do I push harder? But what is making this difficult? And how do I remove that obstacle? He introduces the idea of what he calls identifying the slow hike constraint, the practice of looking for the single bottleneck that, if removed, would most improve your ability to do the essential things. The image comes from a story of a group hikers where the slowest person creates a bottleneck for the entire group. Rather than motivating everyone to walk faster, the most effective intervention is simply to identify the slowest person and find a way to help them specifically. The same principle applies to personal productivity. There is almost always one specific obstacle, one friction, one missing resource, one poorly designed process that is doing most of the damage. Finding and removing that one thing typically produces more improvement than any general increase in effort. He also introduces what he calls creating a buffer, the deliberate, systematic addition of slack to your commitments, and estimates that protects against the near-universal human tendency to underestimate how long things take. Research on planning fallacies consistently shows that people underestimate completion time for tasks by an average of 50%. McKeon's prescription is not to simply multiply your estimates by a fixed factor, though that is a start. It is to develop the habit of anticipating what could go wrong before beginning a project, specifically to ask, what risks haven't I planned for? And building protection against those risks into your timeline and resources before they materialize. The section on routine is one of the most practically actionable in the entire book. McKeon argues that routine, the habitualization of your most important behaviors, the making automatic of the things that need to happen consistently, is the essentialist's most powerful tool for execution. Because the essential things that need to happen every day are most at risk from the cognitive tax of constant redecision. Every day you decide whether to exercise is a day you might decide not to. Every day you decide whether to do the deep work in the morning is a day you might get seduced by email instead. Converting your most essential behaviors into habits, removing the decision from the equation, and letting the routine carry the behavior is not laziness. It is the conservation of your most limited resource, the willpower and executive function required for genuinely difficult decisions. He closes the execute section with what he calls the power of small wins, the minimum viable progress concept that builds momentum through early, incremental success. The research on progress and motivation is unambiguous. Of all the factors that drive engagement and persistence in meaningful work, the single most powerful is the experience of forward movement. Small wins build the psychological momentum that sustains effort through the long stretches where the outcome is not yet visible. And the essentialist discipline of focusing resources on a few things rather than spreading them across many is precisely what makes meaningful progress, the progress you can actually feel more likely on the things that matter. Part 8. The Courage of Essentialism. Why this is harder than it sounds. McKeon is honest throughout the book about the fact that essentialism is not a productivity system you implement once and then enjoy. It is a practice, and a practice that requires a specific and underappreciated form of courage, the courage that it takes to say no to good things, to disappoint people who have legitimate claims on your time, to appear less accommodating than your culture rewards, and to make the trade-offs that you know to be right even when they're not comfortable. He uses the story of a gifted Stanford student who was offered an invitation to attend an exclusive dinner with a prominent Silicon Valley investor on the same night as a final exam. The student had spent weeks preparing for the exam. The dinner was flattering, the investor was impressive, and the social pressure of the invitation was real. McKeon's question is, what does the essentialist do? And his answer is clear. They go to the exam. Not because the investor doesn't matter, but because the exam is part of their essential intent. The study has already been done and deserves to be honored. And saying yes to the dinner would not only compromise the exam, but would signal to themselves that external validation takes precedence over their own established priorities. He introduces the concept of what he calls graceful no, the art of declining in a way that respects the relationship while being genuinely clear about the decision. The most useful formulations are not elaborate explanations or extensive apologies. They are brief, honest, and warm. I can't take that on right now, but let me suggest someone who could. That's not something I'm able to commit to in a way that would serve you well. I'm going to have to pass on this one. The relationship is preserved. The clarity is maintained. And the boundary is drawn without the passive aggression of the half-yes that eventually dissolves into non-delivery. He also addresses the cultural context that makes essentialism difficult, specifically the hustle culture that has dominated much of the professional world for the last 2 decades, which treats busyness as both a badge of honor and a competitive advantage. McKeown's critique of hustle culture is direct. Busyness is not a proxy for achievement. Activity is not the same as progress. The person who is always busy is not necessarily producing more value than the person who is deliberately selective. They are simply producing more output, which is a very different thing. Quality of contribution, not quantity of activity, is what actually matters in any field where the work is substantive. And the path to quality is always through some version of less but better. Part 9. Flow and the Essentialist Life. What it actually feels like the closing chapters of the book are the most personal and the most aspirational, addressing not just the tactical question of how to prioritize, but the experiential question of what it feels like to live essentialistically, to have genuinely aligned your daily choices with your deepest values. McKeown uses the concept of flow, Csikszentmihalyi's research on optimal experience, to describe what the essentialist is aiming for. Flow states, as the research describes them, arise when a person is engaged in activity that is challenging at precisely the right level, difficult enough to require genuine skill and full attention, but not so difficult as to produce overwhelm. And they are, almost by definition, incompatible with the scattered, fragmented attention of the person who is trying to do everything at once. You cannot be in flow while monitoring 3 simultaneous projects, responding to a constant stream of messages, and mentally rehearsing the 5 other things you should have been doing instead. The essentialist creates the conditions for flow by eliminating the competition for their attention, by saying no to the things that would fragment their focus, by designing their environment to remove the most common sources of distraction, by building the routines that allow their best work to happen with minimum friction. They are not waiting for inspiration to strike or energy to arrive. They are engineering the conditions under which inspiration and energy are most likely to arise. He also describes the essentialist relationship with time in a way that feels genuinely different from the conventional productivity framing. The person living by the non-essentialist default is always behind, always catching up, always anxious about the gap between what needs to be done and what is getting done. The essentialist, who has protected their time by declining the avalanche of good but not essential commitments, is more likely to feel, not leisurely, not under-challenged, but genuinely in control. Not of outcomes, which are never fully controllable, but of their own allocation of the finite resource of their life. McKeown ends with an image that has stayed with readers across the decade since the book was published. He describes standing at a deathbed and asking the question, what would you wish you had spent more time on? Not done more of in the aggregate, but genuinely spent more time on with real presence, real contribution, real engagement. Almost nobody at that moment says they wish they had attended more meetings or answered more emails. Almost everybody reaches for something that required exactly what essentialism prescribes: focused attention, deliberate choice, and the courage to say no to the things that didn't actually matter so that the things that did could have what they deserved. The critique, where essentialism falls short, assumes too much, and earns honest scrutiny. Now let's be genuinely honest. Because this book has specific and significant problems that deserve careful naming, not to dismiss what is genuinely valuable in it, but because the limitations are real and in some cases matter enough to affect how the advice lands for different readers in different circumstances. Let's begin with the critique that is raised most consistently and most compellingly: the privilege problem. Essentialism, as McKeown describes it, requires a fundamental thing that he never names or acknowledges: the power to say no to your superiors, your clients, and your obligations without catastrophic consequences. And that power is not equally distributed. The senior executive with an established reputation and irreplaceable expertise has a very different relationship with the word no than the junior employee in their first job. The contractor dependent on a single client's continued goodwill, the parent working 2 jobs to cover basic expenses, or anyone operating in an environment where perceived noncompliance genuinely threatens their livelihood or safety. McKeown's examples throughout the book are almost exclusively drawn from the professional worlds of Silicon Valley executives, Stanford students, and senior leaders at major organizations. These are people with significant professional capital, enough accumulated reputation, and demonstrated value that saying no to non-essential requests is a realistic option. They can decline the meeting. They can pass on the opportunity. They can tell their manager what to deprioritize. The person who is 3 months into their first professional role, or who is in a deeply hierarchical workplace, or who is economically precarious, does not have the same options. And the book's silence on this asymmetry, its implicit universalization of advice that works well for people who are already successful and relatively powerful, is one of its most significant limitations. Second, the binary framework of essentialist versus non-essentialist is rhetorically powerful and practically misleading. McKeown draws the contrast sharply throughout. The essentialist says no to the trivial many and yes to the vital few. The non-essentialist says yes to everything and achieves nothing important. The essentialist lives intentionally, the non-essentialist drifts. The essentialist is deliberate, the non-essentialist is reactive. This contrast is useful as a conceptual tool. It is destructive as a description of how most people actually have to navigate their lives. Most real lives exist not at either of these poles, but in genuinely difficult territory in between, where the essential and the non-essential are often not clearly distinguishable. Where saying no to some obligations would harm relationships that matter, where the trivial many includes real commitments to real people who depend on you. The person caring for an aging parent while raising young children while holding down a demanding job is not a non-essentialist who needs a mindset shift. They are a person genuinely overloaded by obligations that are not optional and cannot be evaluated by the 90% rule without doing real harm. The clean binary between the essentialist who has figured it out and the non-essentialist who hasn't is a simplification that can make people in genuinely difficult circumstances feel that their inability to eliminate the non-essential reflects a failure of discipline rather than a reality of competing legitimate demands. Third, the concept of essential intent, while genuinely useful for people with sufficient clarity about their values and priorities to articulate it, is presented as more accessible and more obvious than it actually is for many people. McKeown says, figure out your one essential intent and let it guide everything else. But the process of figuring out what genuinely matters most to you, distinguishing the authentic values from the internalized expectations of parents and culture and professional environment, is precisely the hard work that most people spend years in therapy trying to do. What is your essential intent? Is not a question with an obvious answer for someone who has spent their entire adult life performing obligations rather than choosing commitments. The book gestures at this difficulty, but does not give it the space it deserves. Fourth, the book is repetitive in a way that is hard to overlook given its central message. A book arguing for less but better should, in principle, model its thesis by delivering its ideas once, clearly and compellingly, and then stopping. Essentialism does not do this. The same core ideas, say no, be selective, protect your time, resist the undisciplined pursuit of more, recur across the book in different chapters with different examples and different framing, but without meaningfully deepening the argument. Many readers have noted that the book's core content could be delivered in a fraction of its 260 pages without significant loss. The repetition pads it into a full-length book, but pads it in a way that the book's own philosophy would condemn. This is not a fatal flaw, but it is an irony that the author never acknowledges. Fifth, the book is specifically written for a professional audience in a way that limits its applicability to other domains of life. The language, the examples, the framing, all of it comes from a world of careers, projects, meetings, and organizational dynamics. The application of essentialist thinking to personal relationships, to creative life, to caregiving, to the quieter and more private dimensions of what it means to live well. These are mentioned but not developed with the same depth and specificity as the professional applications. A person whose primary domain of life is not their career but their family, their art, their community, may find the book's practical tools less immediately applicable, even if the underlying philosophy speaks to them. Sixth, the book gives relatively little attention to the hard question of what to do when the process of identifying the essential produces an answer that conflicts with what you currently have. McEwen tells you to identify your highest point of contribution and protect time for it. But what happens when your highest point of contribution would require leaving your current job? Ending a relationship that isn't aligned with your essential intent? Moving away from the community you're embedded in? Disappointing people who depend on you in ways that the essentialist framework would classify as non-essential? The book's practical tools are strong for the person whose life needs adjustment. They are less complete for the person whose life needs something closer to reconstruction. And finally, the critique that applies to every book in this genre, always and without exception, and that here has a specific additional weight because of the book's own subject matter. Reading about essentialism is not practicing it. The experience of finishing this book and feeling clarified and resolved is the experience of thinking about the right things. It is not the experience of doing them. The actual work of essentialism, the daily, uncomfortable, socially pressured, deeply countercultural practice of saying no to genuinely appealing things, of protecting time and energy in the face of real competing demands, of maintaining clarity about your highest purpose in an environment that is constantly pulling your attention toward the urgent at the expense of the important, is entirely different from the experience of reading about it. The knowing-doing gap here is particularly acute because the skills essentialism requires, the ability to tolerate social discomfort, to make peace with disappointing others, to trust your own judgment about what matters in the face of external pressure, are exactly the skills that most people have not developed and that cannot be developed through reading alone. They require practice, which means they require repetition in real situations, which means they require the willingness to fail at it, to feel uncomfortable, to hold the boundary even when it costs you something. The book will not do that work for you. It will give you one of the clearest, most compelling articulations of why that work is worth doing. The doing remains yours. Final thoughts. There is a story McEwen tells near the end of Essentialism about a woman named Nora who, after hearing him speak, came up to him and described what the ideas in the book had meant for her life. She had been, before encountering essentialism, an extremely successful lawyer, by every external measure, thriving, partner track, prestigious firm, all of it, and completely miserable. Not dramatically miserable. Just the quiet, persistent, underneath everything misery of someone who has spent a decade becoming very good at something they never actually wanted. She changed course. She left the law. She built something new, in a direction that was genuinely aligned with what she cared about, in a domain where she found genuine satisfaction in the work itself. And she told McEwen that the moment she understood that she had been choosing, that the career that felt like an inescapable obligation had actually been a continuous series of choices that she had never fully owned, was the moment everything changed. Not because the change was easy, but because the possibility became visible. If you don't prioritize your life, McEwen writes, someone else will. This is the sentence the book is built around. Not as a threat, as an observation about the structure of a life lived without clarity about what genuinely matters. The pressures are real. The opportunities are real. The social expectations are real. None of them are going away. The only question is whether you are navigating them with a clear sense of your own direction or whether you are being navigated by them. Essentialism is not the answer to that question. It is the argument that the question matters, that you should be asking it deliberately, regularly, and with real honesty about the gap between the life you are living and the life you would choose if you were choosing it fully. That gap, honestly seen, is the beginning of everything else. Less but better. It will not stop being true no matter how many times it needs to be said.